Thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to speak to an audience in Rutland on a maple history topic of any kind, but especially the topic of the G.H. Grimm Company, which has such an important piece in the legacy of maple sugaring in Vermont and Rutland. I'm not sure. I imagine there's a variety of folks in this room that have different connections or interests in this story. Some might be sugar makers themselves, some might be history buffs of Vermont or Rutland, some might be downright, experts on the G.H. Grimm story, some may be former employees of the G.H. Grimm Company. There's all kinds of possibilities for this audience, which is, for me, that's exciting to have such a range of folks. The Grimm story is one that a lot of people know a little bit about in Vermont maple history, especially in the Rutland area. There's been articles and newspaper articles and some published Historical Society pieces, especially a great one that was in the Rutland Historical Society journal by Bob Moore, now 40 years ago, I guess. But what I was interested in doing in one of my many maple history research projects was kind of doing a deeper dive into the G.H. Grimm story. So I kind of revisited as much of the research that other people did and went a little bit deeper where I could. In particular, trying to really narrow in on some of the documentation and the dates and the specifics. There's a really decent understanding of the general narrative of the Grimm story, but sometimes different storylines get some of the edges and the dates and other things confused and overlapping, and that's normal and that's fine. But it seemed to me like a good time to really tackle it for what it was worth and then share it. So the focus of this is, as the title says, a champion of the maple syrup industry, the first 100 years of the Grimm Company. I'll go beyond a little bit more than 100 years, but I really wanted to go deeper into how did it all really get started and what are some of the earlier stories and storylines related to the Grimm, because that's the furthest back and that's the stuff that's less well known, and bring that especially to a Rutland audience, because a lot of that is an Ohio story. So first of all, why is the Grimm story important? Well, G.H. Grimm G.H. Grimm Manufacturing Company manufactured maple syrup evaporators, maple sap evaporators, and sugar making, syrup making equipment. Most notably, the Champion evaporator was the brand that they used in the early years. And there's a lot of evaporator companies, especially that came out of Ohio, but the Grimm Company and its later legacy in Rutland is significant because at the turn of the century, it became the biggest and the most important and the most respected and most popular of evaporators in the United States and Canada. And so while that changed over time as the evaporator company industry evolved, but the Grimm and the Champion name were synonymous with the best. And so it deserves the attention that it has gotten and is getting tonight. But let's go really way back to how did it all start. So Gustav H. Grimm, the man in the picture here, was born in 1850 in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, and at age 14 in 1864, he emigrated to Ohio with his brother Frederick, who was a few years younger. They came to Ohio, probably Cleveland, Ohio, although it's interesting, there's not a lot of great genealogical type documentation for Gustav Grimm and his family. I've really had to piece a lot of things together and kind of work around the edges to build the story clearly, but what I have come to understand is that Gustav's father, Frank Grimm, probably never made it from Germany, probably died in Germany, and then Gustav and Fred moved to the United States. We also know that their mother, Anna Catherine, who went by Katie, emigrated to the United States, but I don't know if she did with them or a little bit later. We do know she did come to the United States, and she lived with Fred in Cleveland until she died in the 1890s. There's no evidence that the father, Frank Grimm, ever came to the United States. But who did come to the United States was Frank's brothers, John W. and Gottfried and Henry Grimm. And they came in the 1850s, a little bit earlier, and settled into Cleveland. So uncles, two brothers, the Grimm family came to the United States from Germany, 1850s, 1860s. And they settled in Cleveland, except for, like I said, we don't have any real evidence that Gustav lived in Cleveland. I mean, in the sense that I haven't found a record of it, but it makes sense that he did, because his brother Fred did, and all the other rest of the family did as well. And they were all in the tin smithing hardware business. So Uncle John W. Grimm, this pink area was his tinsmith metal workshop. This says Tin Works right in here on Woodland Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. And John W. Grimm, Uncle Grimm's oldest son, Fred, took over that company, different from Fred, the brother of Gustav Grimm. And I'll call him, and he went by Gus as well. He was Gus Grimm. What's important in this tree here is, so Wendelin Grimm and Maria Anna Schaefer, they were the parents of Frank Grimm, Gottfried Grimm, John Grimm, Henry Grimm. Gustav over here with Fred, those are brothers on that line. So then you have these three cousins of son of John. They'll come around again. You'll see those names. They're very important later on. But they all, not all of them, but almost all of them came from a metalworking, tin, hardware kind of background, which is interesting and important for what G.H. Grimm did later on. As far as Gus Grimm's family, as I said, he was the son of Frank and Anna. His brother Frederick here, he married Esther Logan in 1871 in Summit County, Ohio, which is where Hudson, Ohio is. We don't know if they actually got married in Hudson. We just know that it was registered in Summit County. They had 4 children, Harry, Nella, were in the Nella Fox Grimm room, Helen Grimm, and Florence Grimm. And they were all born in Hudson, Ohio. So that's a little bit of the background on who they were. So Gustav Grimm, born in Germany, moved at age 14, probably didn't speak English. It's fascinating to think about some of those realities of coming to this new country. 10 years later, at age 24, he's actively engaged in the Hudson community. He is elected constable in town. He is working in another individual's tin shop. But in a short period of time, he's well ingrained as an American and became an American citizen the year after he got married. And now Hudson is his home. So as I said, he came from a background in metalwork, tin work. He worked in the tin shop of John L. Chapman initially. So he didn't have his own business right away. He worked for John L. Chapman. In the late 1870s, he opens his own stove, hardware, tin shop on Main Street. And he moved around at different locations on Main Street, from building owned by a guy named Campbell to another one owned by a guy named Markville. I love that name. 1870, like I said, 1877 is the first evidence we have of him being independent and having his own shop. John L. Chapman and he had a bit of a falling out, and as we've learned from the research, John L. Chapman had a lot of falling outs with people in Hudson, and he was known to be one of the most litigious guys in town. In the case of G.H. Grimm didn't make it any easier on himself. He put ads in the paper essentially disparaging the Chapman Company and how it did business, and in response, Chapman started forget the word, but he disparaged Esther Grimm, and that led to Gustav filing a lawsuit against John Chapman, and back and forth, and Chapman went after Grimm again in the paper. Grimm's response was to take a walk down the street with his shotgun and intimidate Mr. Chapman, which that got then law enforcement involved. Well, they didn't call it law enforcement then, but eventually it went to court, and Chapman lost for his comments against Esther Grimm, and was forced to pay $500 as a fine, of which $100 was ever realized. He never paid anything more than that. But interesting times on Main Street in Hudson, Ohio. They didn't always see eye to eye about things. And as you can see in this ad over here, Grimm, he was a stove dealer, and he made metal items and things, but he was big into stoves and stove dealing, and was a salesman, a merchant. He wasn't a maple sugar guy. He wasn't a farmer. There's not a lot of photos of G.H. Grimm ever, or from Hudson. This is one really rare one that we found that shows him in this buggy, and this is him with the cigar here. This isn't anyone he had business associates with that we know about, just an individual he knew in town, but it's a great timely photo, but I wish we had more photos of him like that. It's pretty rare. It did well enough pretty early on that by 1879 he built a house. He and his wife Esther did on 55 Oviatt Street in Hudson. Costed about $800 to build. It was a very simple kind of Victorian-esque house. It was later owned by the Rideout family, so it's been referred to as the Grimm Rideout House. When they left Hudson to come to Ohio, it was sold in 1894. Tragically, 2 of the Grimm children passed away in this house. So son Harry, born in 1872, died in 1881 from drowning. Unfortunately, it was tragic, or complications of drowning, almost drowning. And then daughter Florence died from the measles in 1887. The house still stands. It's been expanded. It's a beautiful house. It's one of the finest houses now in Hudson. This was the original part of the house. It's been expanded this way, out this way. It's got big gardens in back that weren't there before or during the Grimm time period. But it's just nice to see the house still standing. But it's even finer than it really ever was at that time. Now moving to Grimm's, how did the whole maple evaporator thing? Well, start with him. He was, I say, a tinsmith and a stove guy, sometimes making items for people on request, but mostly he was just selling hardware and metalware. But a fellow named Horace M. Clark, who was a farmer and a sugar maker just outside of town in Hudson, came to him. Horace Clark was dabbling with his own evaporator design, but not in the idea of manufacturing. He was more of a tinkerer, an inventor, and he came to Grimm in 1851 with some ideas that he had been developing, and together they added some more improvements, most notably some raised flues. Now, if you're familiar with evaporator design, flues are, you can have evaporators with flat pans where it's just a flat bottom, or flues that can be dropped or raised where you have deep corrugations that are designed to multiply, increase the surface area from the heat in the firebox under the evaporator, transferring to the sap and improving and greater efficiency and speed to the boiling process. Before this time, there were not flues. There were flat pans, and there were flat pans that had baffles and a maze-like system to create a continuous flow of sap. But flues were a novelty, a new thing, and this was the addition that Gustav Grimm brought to it. And his were special in the very beginning because they were raised flues. Other evaporators today, you'll see drop flues. His design in the beginning was a raised flue. So together in 1851, they submitted a patent, and it was awarded in March 1881. 1882, the patent was awarded. Grimm had already, in 1881, Grimm was starting to manufacture and sell evaporators. So you'll see different numbers on when the G.H. Grimm company started or when Grimm started manufacturing evaporators. And 1881 is the earliest year of manufacturing. He made about a dozen of them in 1881, and he pretty much got the bug and shifted his focus to completely making evaporators and got out of the stove business and other metal equipment manufacturing. Horace Clarke was an interesting fella. He sadly suffered from some issues with mental illness starting in about 1884 until in the next 10 years he was in and out of a mental institution, a sane asylum in northern Ohio. Off and on, he would have these bouts where he would be found walking down the railroad tracks convinced that he was the train conductor and trying to direct the trains, and other times he thought he was the sheriff and he was trying to arrest people, and all kinds of other crazy stories that are in the, and back in that day, everything was in the newspaper. Every little detail that happened in somebody's lives was shared in the newspaper. And the thing was, he was known to be kind of a genius. I mean, he was I wouldn't say a mad scientist per se, but he was known to be a very brilliant man when he was having his good days. And there was this really interesting quote that I shared in the Akron Beacon in 1892 that says, "Clarke was one of the brightest men who ever graduated from Western Reserve University, but several years ago went crazy over a sap machine. And every year when sugar time comes, Clarke gets wild and has to be confined." And it also spilled over to his relationship with Gustav Grimm and Clarke's wife, Horace Clarke's wife, Isabella. She started in 1897. She sued Grimm and his later partners for patent that she didn't feel that Horace and her were compensated fairly for the patent that they had together in 1882. I don't know what the compensation was. I never found anything to say what agreement that they had that she felt wasn't sufficient, because they probably never realized how successful it was going to be. But she continued to sue, in and out of court, repeated cases, and trying to find different angles against Grimm and his partner, Mr. Parsons, who we'll bring up in a little bit. But eventually, she never was successful, and it was dismissed. But there was there was conflict in Hudson. Things weren't always so cozy amongst the folks in the evaporator and the metalworking business. And I don't know this. I mean, you could speculate that why did Gustav Grimm choose to leave Hudson eventually? He lost 2 children there. He had conflicts within the community. Maybe that was a bit of a push. There was a pull from Vermont, which I'll talk about next, but there was also a bit of a push maybe out of Ohio. So 1882, he starts using G.H. Grimm and Company as a business name. By the spring of '83, he's manufacturing 30 evaporators. Later that year, I found another story that he has made 150 evaporators. So he's really, really taken off in the evaporator company business. In 1883, he partners with William C. Parsons, a businessman from Akron. That was really pretty much a business partnership. Parsons had hands in all kinds of other businesses. He wasn't a hands-on guy in the company. They are still manufacturing in a shop on Main Street. And then keep moving forward, 1888, they formally incorporate in Ohio as the G.H. Grimm Manufacturing Company. At that time, Herbert Hitchcock joins as a partner, again, a business partner, not someone who comes in with new designs or has a experience in the manufacturing or metalwork business. And then 1890 expands the company, opens a plant in Rutland, Vermont. Now, that's kind of a teaser for where we're going to go next. I'm going to finish out what bit of the Rutland or the Hudson story here, because then the big story really is what happens in Rutland. So initial evaporator patent with Clark in 1882, but then Grimm gets, maybe anticipating some conflicts with Clark, he gets his own solo patent in 1884 with some more design tweaks that are really part of his important contribution of the raised flues. So if you see here these little ridges, and Grimm called this a corrugated pan. He didn't use the term raised flues. That's an industry term these days. He called it a corrugated pan. But he patented in 1885, as it's called, the art of making evaporator pans. I love that. He patented a method for folding the metal to make these raised flues that didn't require it to be soldered. And that was important because when sometimes sap would be left in the pans overnight if you didn't finish making your syrup, it could freeze in some of these old sugar houses. And if they were soldered, it was really hard on the seams. But these folded ones didn't leak when they froze as badly. It's much more of a durable design, which was pretty interesting and important. What was interesting in their design too is that, as you can see in this picture here, in most modern evaporators, the sap enters in the back. The sap pans are in the rear, and the syrup pans are in the front. In their design, the sap pans were by the front of the firebox, and the syrup pans were back here. Interesting difference, and things changed over time, but that's how they began. Later, it was called the Evaporator Works. It later became the Champion Evaporator Company, which I'll talk about, and that is all still standing. So the Champion Evaporator Company, when Gustav Grimm left in 1890, when Gustav Grimm came to Rutland to start a Rutland branch, a Rutland plant in 1890, he still had the plant in Hudson. When he decided he was going to permanently relocate himself and his family in 1894 to Rutland, he severed his connections completely to Hudson. So his partners, Parsons and Hitchcock, they split the company. They kept the Hudson branch. He took the Rutland branch. Then the partners, then Hudson and Hitchcock, they sold out completely in 1896 to Charles Bouton and Son, his son was Clarence Bouton, and Charles was working in the plant, so he bought out Parsons and Hitchcock. Now, at that point, it's not even a Grimm business anymore. It changes its name to Champion Evaporator Company because they were given the rights to keep making the Champion design, the Champion evaporators. So it's really interesting because you see Champion in Hudson, and it's one company. You see Champion Evaporator being made in Rutland, it's another company. And as I'll get to in a second, you see Champion being made in Montreal, which is another company. And it's all the same design in the beginning, but they all have the start with G.H. Grimm, but it was a process of division over time. So Champion Evaporator continues to operate in Hudson, Ohio till 1942, and they didn't make a lot of evaporators, but you'll see the Champion, embossed on the iron face of the evaporators, and Champion advertising and things. And folks think that's G.H. Grimm, but it's not. It historically has a connection, but it's not the same. So the Champion Evaporator Company, the Champion Evaporator Works, continued to operate till 1942. Then it ended right during the war era, but the buildings were still there. In 1980s, the city of Hudson did a big redevelopment of this, and now it's shops and all kinds of small businesses, and they call it the Evaporator Works, which is kind of neat that it has this legacy that's still there. And if you really want to geek out and go on a Grimm pilgrimage, there's a Gustav Grimm historic marker at the Champion Evaporator Works, which is pretty cool, I think. We need one here now, too, but just if anybody wants to take on a project, I'll help you. So, Rutland. 1890, Grimm decides to come and open a plant in Rutland. He didn't originally plan to come to Rutland. He wanted to go to St. Johnsbury. But the folks in Rutland had their act together. The businessmen of Rutland found out that he was coming to Vermont looking at different locations to open an additional plant. And he liked the St. Johnsbury idea because it had a big railroad hub, big railroad network. He was interested in getting into the maple landscape, the world of maple a little bit more than northern Ohio, which did have an important maple industry. But Vermont was more where he was going to sell evaporators. He wanted connections to Canada, which St. Johnsbury had great rail connections to Canada. But the businessmen of Rutland heard about it, offered him a tax break, and being a wise businessman that he was, he said, "Sure, I like Rutland. I'll go there. We'll do that." So in 1890, he built the first plant in Rutland, which this is the Grimm building today. This is where the first plant was built across the street. You can see on the Sanborn map, here's a drawing of it, just for cross-reference. It was a one-story, kind of low-sloped gabled roof with a two-story tower, which he had his office in, this little bump out here. 120 by 40 feet wood structure, pretty nondescript, but that's where it got started for him in Rutland. And with his move to Rutland, he really started expanding beyond just evaporators and into more maple sugaring equipment, more into pails and sap pail covers and sugaring off arches. What was one of the important things too about their early design was these siphons, which connected the pans, and I'll show you again in another picture of the whole evaporator layout. This was an important innovation that he had. He had a special, they called it a Grimm regulator. This is a float system for regulating the level of sap in the evaporator tanks. Other manufacturers had other designs for float boxes and float machines, but part of the whole Grimm and champion design included these important features and became synonymous with the champion. The spout came a little bit later, early 1900s, but those became one of the most popular, the Grimm sap spout, one of the most popular sap spouts by sheer number of spouts that were being made and used. In 1892, further expansion happened by opening the Montreal G.H. Grimm facility. It moved to 1896, it moved to Wellington Street, which is this building here. This building still stands. I'll show you a kind of a neat picture about it in a minute. But this was where they were for many, many years in Montreal. So his cousin, John H. Grimm, became not till 1900, but he became the guy who ran the Montreal operation. The three cousins, John Grimm, Henry Grimm, and Edward Grimm, in the 1890s, they kind of bopped back and forth between Cleveland, working for their dad's tinsmith business, and working for G.H. Grimm's Rutland business. So you'll find evidence, one directory, well, 1 year they'll be in Rutland, 1 year they'll be in Cleveland, but always working in the tin business, kind of learning the trade. Unfortunately for John, in early 1900, in Rutland, he lost both thumbs working on the metal bending equipment. And so later that year, he bought out Gustav's interest in the Montreal plant and became the controlling interest in the Montreal business, which led to the three cousins becoming the Montreal side of the Grimm family. Between 1900 and 1910, those three brothers, the cousins, all moved from Ohio or Rutland to Montreal and remained there the rest of their lives running the company. In 1910, they formally incorporated as the Grimm Manufacturing Company, not the G.H. Grimm, the Grimm Manufacturing Company with John Grimm as the president, and the others as the officers. That continued to be an affiliated company and they used the Champion name for their evaporator all the way through as long as it existed, and continued to as have it as a big family business. Their sons and grandsons got involved, but one by one, as those three brothers died, and it got down to the last brother passing, the family decided to sell the Montreal branch to a guy named Sylvain Lebrun, who ran the Dominion Evaporator Company in Montreal, and that became then Dominion and Grimm, which still exists to this day. In Montreal, they have a branch office, a sales space in St. Albans, Dominion and Grimm USA, but with their legacy of continuation going all the way back to 1891, that makes Dominion and Grimm the longest continually operating evaporator company in the world, and it's all on that Grimm storyline. I'm going to be giving a similar talk to the Dominion and Grimm Evaporator Company open house Friday and Saturday. If you want to hear this again in St. Albans, you can go to the Maple Festival up there. It's a great time. Might be a little wet, but you can see this talk with a little bit extra tweaking for the Dominion and Grimm audience, talking a little bit more about their history. It's great to know that the Grimm legacy has continued on. I love this picture because this is just a postcard of the G.H. Grimm or the Grimm Manufacturing Company in about 1900 in Wellington. This is a Google Street View shot. Looks like they're not in that building anymore because when they joined with the Dominion Evaporator Company, they went to the Dominion Company space, which was a newer facility, and they've since moved into an even newer one. But I love how absolutely similar to the car and the people on the street corner you can find with a picture like this. So when G.H. Grimm got to Rutland, he started with the 1890 plant. In 1894, he started building a house and finished in 1895, moved in 1895 on Grove Street. Those of you who are from Rutland probably are familiar with. You may not have known it was the Grimm house. It was named, they called it Ivy Home. It was designed by architect Arthur Smith. It's a beautiful 13-room house, just gorgeous corner on the corner of Grove. What's the cross street? It's right next to Linden Terrace, if you know of that important house as well, which will come up a little bit more in this story. It's a shingle style house, 13 rooms, as I said. It has a great little carriage house next to it. Gorgeous inside. All the wonderful original woodwork is still there and preserved. Great light. GH carved on the fireplace surround. I got the opportunity to take pictures and visit the house last year with the owners, and I don't see them. Are they here? No, they were invited, but fortunately they didn't make it. I just love the idea you can have like a 30-foot Christmas tree right up the middle there. And that's right in the center of the house. Some great photos. Unfortunately, none of these were labeled. They were in an album that was left in the house when the current owners, Mark and Peter, bought the house. We know where they are because they're clearly in the side yard and the backyard of the house. This one's a great one because it's not really bright, but you can see how open the landscape was out looking over to the east into Rutland. We don't know who these individuals are. Like, for example, there's a little boy here. G.H. Grimm's son never made it to Rutland. Don't know it. He's too old to be any of the cousins, so we don't know who it is. We do know from stories that they always had dogs, and clearly that's true in the photos as well. I don't know if that's Esther Grimm. I'd like to believe it is, or this one, but we don't know. But again, like I said, there's very, very, very few photos from the family. So this is about as close as it gets. And as you can see in this picture and these pictures, they had really extensive gardens in the back. And Later on in the years ahead, Nella Grimm and her mother were known for their parties. They hosted parties and little concerts and things back in the gardens, and they were extensive. And some of these features are still back there, little water features and little fountains and paths that are overgrown in the backyard, but they're still back in there. These two pictures are really kind of interesting because they're on the other side of this wall in a bathroom here in the library. And I've never seen them before, and I was here asking about Grimm history, and Amy was saying, well, I didn't have a lot of stuff, but these might be kind of interesting. And lo and behold, they were these great hand-colored images of the gardens at the Ivy Home House. I say that they had extensive gardens, lawn, and maple trees. There was no maple forest there. There was about 20 maple trees, and why that's even relevant is that G.H. Grimm didn't have a sugar bush, but he would tap trees and do experiments, including tapping trees in November. He started testing the pre-winter or late or fall tapping, which people have talked about these days, but he was giving it a go in the early 1800s. Grimm Company also was heavily involved in packing maple syrup and sugar. Most people don't know that about them. They would take as payment syrup and sugar for purchase of evaporators and supplies. And to process it, they first had a factory on the just north of West Street. Later, when they built another evaporator company, or new building, they moved to the upper floors of that on Pine Street. They called it the Green Mountain Maple Sugar and Syrup Company for a few years, and continued to do that into the 1940s, using that as a way of payment, and then bulk sales and some special client sales with that. Grimm Company was in the stove business. People maybe didn't know that they made household ranges. In 1897, began building steel ranges, manufactured them in Rutland, over a dozen shapes and sizes. Not a lot of them around. If people ever see one, they're pretty beautiful, pretty neat little items. Another little interesting side note about the Grimm Company was a special partnership they had with the Horseshoe Forestry Company. It's very unique in that the Horseshoe Forestry Company at the time, at the turn of the last century, was the largest single maple syrup making business in the world. And the owner, A.A. Lowe, partnered with Gustav Grimm and bought all of his equipment for maple sugar making there, which that's a lot of equipment. He had 4 separate sugar houses with 4 to 5 of the very largest evaporators in each one. He had 50,000 taps, bought all of that equipment from G.H. Grimm, so these massive orders would come in. And Grimm used it in his advertising too. The Horseshoe was known to be the biggest in the world, and he would proudly say, we're the suppliers for the Horseshoe Company. It was even such a partnership that they developed some special items where this is a sap pail that is embossed with Horseshoe Forestry Company, G.H. Grimm, Rutland, designed by A.A. Lowe for their company, and made here in Rutland, special for them. The Grimm Company, maybe folks don't know this, they had a special little evaporator sugar house at the Rutland Fair. It's gone now. It would have been, you can see in this picture, this building still stands with a Red Cross. The safety building, I think, is what, I don't know what it's called, but first aid building. It was right next to that. Built in 1896, display Grimm Company equipment. Last used by the Grimm Company in 1951. So the next building, the second Rutland building, as I like to call it, was built, started in 1898, finished in 1899. That building is the building we think of today as the G.H. Grimm building on Pine Street. So here was the other building, and 1898-99 was that building. It was originally looked like this. It was 150 by 50 feet, 3 stories plus a basement with a gable roof. It had a freight elevator. It had a big boiler inside. Here's a better picture of it, photograph of it, what it looked like when it was originally built. In 1907, this building, which had been leased out when they built this new building, it was cut in half and moved in two separate sections to behind. So the building that still stands there behind is this original building. It was quite an endeavor to move it across the street, but they were able to do it. And so here you see that building. That's the original building right there. Sadly, in 1908, the Grimm family started the first of two tragedies. Daughter Helen Grimm committed suicide at age 26, possibly because there was some false rumors about her and some relationships being spread around town, and she took her own life. In 1914, Gustav died. He had not been well. He'd been sick for a few years. In 1912, he had gone and spent a month at a spa in Michigan, probably starting to try to find ways to improve his health. In 1913, maybe seeing that he was declining, he took a trip around the world for 4 months with 3 other guys from Rutland. And literally sailed around the world and came back 4 months later. In 1914, he died from general paralysis, which is a degenerative neurological disease from untreated syphilis, which is interesting. I won't say more than that, but age 64. So this is a picture of Helen here. Sadly, things were not good from 1908 to 1914. The company went into, you'll see things listed as the G.H. Grimm estate is running the company. And the next door neighbor, Herman Vaughn, who lived literally in the house adjacent to them, which is today's Linden Terrace on Grove Street, he was the executor and ran the company for a few years until later in the 19-teens, Nella stepped up. She had always been groomed because Gustav didn't have a son that lived into adulthood, and he started preparing Nella to take over the company, and she did. And so from the 19-teens into the 1950s, Nella ran the company, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. In 1920, there was a catastrophic fire, Valentine's Day fire, that destroyed the whole upper portion of the evaporator, the Grimm building, with losses totaling $75,000. But they quickly rebuilt. And now this was they made the upper floor into a squared off roof, which like you see today. Again, here's the old building that had been moved that's next to it. This was another ancillary building they had for a short time just back across the street. So Nella, she was a very interesting woman. She took over the company following the death of her father. In 1923, at the age of 49, she married John Crary Fox. So this is the Nella Grimm Fox room. So that's where the Fox comes from. She was known to be a pretty tough cookie, smart with business, well able to speak freely with other gentlemen. There weren't a lot of women running businesses like this at that time. She was good with politics and the stock market and those kinds of things. She was known to be pretty frugal with the company's money, but she was also known to be a person who enjoyed the finer things in life for herself and did not spare a whole lot of expense on things. She did not have any children, and she was said to not really like children very much. She liked her pets. She had a bulldog, she had a monkey, she had a parrot. And there's a story that years later, some of the people that owned the Grimm house were doing some work in the backyard, and they found a tiny little coffin with what they thought was a baby skeleton inside it, and they took it in to be investigated, and it was the monkey, but that was one of her lovely pets. Even though she was known to be the person who managed the company, it was largely left to the management of George Cobb, the plant manager. Nella would take off for a month or two at a time, sometimes with her mother, off to go to the Caribbean for vacation or whatever. You can't really be running the company day to day if you can go away for 2 months at a time on vacation. But she had good people, and she trusted them, and that was important. Her mother, Esther Logan Grimm, dies in 1927. Sadly, John Crary Fox, who when he married Nella, he then came into the company and helped with some of the management of it in the 1920s and early 30s. But he died in his 50s from a heart attack, sadly, much too young. In the evaporator company world, not a lot of things were changing as far as designs from the teens and 20s and 30s. Things kind of, I wouldn't say stagnated, but there was a lot of great design coming out of the 1890s and early 1900s, and then things sort of stalled. You do see an addition of the flue evaporator that they added, which was one where I talked about they have the raised flues was Grimm's design. Later on, they add this flue evaporator, which, as you can see over here, has these big, deep drop flues in the back pan. Then there's a pan with raised flues, so it had a combination. These front pans are flat flues, or flat bottom pans. Interesting design where sap then is entering at the rear, like a lot of other evaporators. Through the 1940s, the maple business was suffering a bit. And World War II made it even harder because you could not get sheet metal to make evaporators and a lot of the other equipment. And so the Grimm company and overall just manufacturing of syrup on a commercial scale was at a low. And the company started to shrink. And it came to a point where Nella was getting older and she was on her own, and so she decided to sell the company. When she sold it in 1951, there were only 10 employees working for the company. So she made the decision to sell it to Robert Moore and Louis Veal in 1951. Robert Moore worked for Patch Wagner, and he was an engineer. Robert Moore worked for Patch Wagner. Louis Veal worked for Green Mountain Power, and they took over the company. Neither one was really from the maple business, but they were really interested in keeping that company going and maybe rebuilding it a bit. Sadly, Louis Veal passed away in 1956, and it all was left to the Moore family as the sole owners. In 1955, one of the interesting innovations they added was the hay tedders. They were trying to keep their employees busy all year round because sometimes it was pretty seasonal work for manufacturing evaporator equipment. And so they added a new product, which was relatively successful and kept things moving for the company. Nella herself passes away in 1969. One of the great things which was mentioned at the introduction this evening was that she left the legacy to three legacies to the city of Rutland: the Rutland Free Library, the Rutland Hospital, and the Grace Congregational United Church. A $2.5 million trust provided funds that would continually be made available to those institutions. And so in 1973, the library named this room in honor of Nella. This is a great picture of her in the gardens with the hand color flowers. So 1951, this company is sold to Robert Moore and Louis Veal. Louis Veal passes. Robert Moore has it for the next number of decades. His sons come into the company to work for him, Robert Moore Jr. and Patrick Moore, through in the 60s and 70s. They're part of the company, and the company starts to keep growing and getting kind of back on its feet and adding a few more things to it. One of the things that's important is in the evaporator company business, and especially in the latter half of the 20th century, there's a whole lot of consolidation that happens. So there was a bunch of big companies like the Leader Evaporator Company, Grimm, Lightning, G.H. Soul, and they start to, as I mentioned, things weren't so strong through the 40s and 50s, and so they start consolidating and selling to one another. So Leader buys G.H. Soul, Leader buys the Vermont Evaporator Company. The Grimm Company buys the Lightning Evaporator Company from Richford, which was a very successful company, added a whole another design element to evaporators and added some product lines. They also brought some of the workers from Richford to come to Rutland to help with that company. But the Moore sons decided that they wanted to go off and do their own business ventures, which they successfully did. And as time went on, Bob Moore was a little, he was getting on in years, and he was starting to have some health issues, so he decided it was time for him to sell the company as well. So in 1984, Bob Moore sold the Grimm company to a group of Rutland investors that was sometimes called the Grimm Group, which was, I've got a typo in there, but for some reason one name is not there, which is Bill Karras, Patrick Garahan, Baird Morgan, Alan George, Thomas Howe. And they were men, they weren't from the maple industry, they came from a variety of different business interests, but they were looking for an investment, and they wanted to keep the company in Rutland as well. So they worked together for a few years and kept it kind of moving. Not a lot changed, not a lot was going up, but they kept it pretty level. And but they decided in 1989 that it was time to sell themselves. An opportunity came from the leader of Apparator. This is a continuation of consolidation. In 1988, the Lamb Tubing Company was brought into Grimm, again part of consolidation. 89, Grimm sold to the leader of Apparator Company, and the Grimm name essentially was done at that point. It was absorbed by the leader company. Although the leader company continued to use the Grimm facility for fabrication for a number of years, and until about 2005, all fabrication activity moved to the St. Albans facility for Leader. And they continued to use the Grimm building for some sales of equipment and such, but in 2020, the doors were completely closed on the Grimm building, ending the Grimm legacy in Rutland. It's a great story. Sadly came to a kind of a slow end, but in other ways, the Grimm, like with the Montreal Dominion and Grimm folks, Grimm is not completely gone. It lives on in other ways. But I hope that there's some future for this building. I don't know. It's hard to, it's an old building, but it's a neat building in some ways. You never know what could happen. That's the gist of my talk. I'd love to have any questions. Q&A is the best way to really dig into things that I missed or folks are looking for more on. I'd like to special thanks for making this talk and this research possible. Amy Williams, Scott Kaufman, Mark Peterzak, Peter Newman. Those are the folks that own the house, the Grimm Mansion. Gwen Meyer, the Hudson Historical Society, the Bill Kirby family, which sadly couldn't be here tonight. They're relations of the Foxes. And the list goes on. But I thank you for your time.